This video is packed full of tips, tricks, hacks and homemade tools. Every build has its own little unique difficulties, and there's often little tips and tricks that will get you past them. Using a tool in a different way than it normally is, or making your own tool to get the job done in an easier or faster way. So what I've done, every time I come across one, I've popped it into one of these videos. I'll even go as far as to say that I bet there is one thing that you've either not seen before or you haven't tried yet. So let's get on with the first one. For this very quick tip, we're going to talk about chisels. I'm just talking about the most common right now, because there's one thing that chisels universally need, and that is to be sharp. But how do you know if your chisel is sharp enough? I've got two to start with. One of these I've got to razor sharp. The other one I've actually run perpendicular to the diamond stone to take the cutting edge off. And the idea of this tip isn't to show off how sharp you can get it. What it's showing is at what stage during a job should you stop and rehone that cutting edge. I've seen two main ways of testing whether your chisel or plain blade is sharp enough. One of which is cutting your arm hair, which is fine so long as you have enough hair to work with. So it's not really universal. The other way is to cut a piece of paper. But these are two extremes. These are the sharpest end and the bluntest end of the spectrum. I guarantee I could pick any chisel out my rack, any chisel that's been used, and they would be sharp enough to do a clean cut, but they wouldn't be sharp enough to do a quality job on a piece of wood. So we need another test. And this one is immensely simple, because for this test what we're going to do is we're going to lock down a piece of wood on the side of the workbench, and then we're going to use the chisel on the end grain. Now surprisingly, what we actually don't want is hardwood. We want softwood for this test. Because the fibres in hardwood are actually quite brittle, you might not easily be able to see if the chisel is actually cutting through them or snapping them off. Whereas with softwood, if it's not slicing through those fibres, then it will mush them and it will squish them, and you'll really easily be able to see just by looking whether your chisel is sharp or not. And if you're left in any doubt while you're actually cutting with the chisel, take a look at the results afterwards. If the wood looks like it's got tear out in it where the fibres have mushed together instead of actually being carved off, sliced off, then your chisel's too blunt. If you've got a smooth, clean, carved finish, then you're absolutely fine to carry on. On to the next tip. So for this tip, we're going to actually make a tool that's going to make your life significantly easier. These are spoke shaves. New or old, when you get them, the iron is going to need some love. The same can be said for a hand plane iron. And in my opinion, the first job that anybody should do when they get them is to flatten the back of the iron. And as you can see for a spoke shave in particular, they're not very big. So getting a grip on them and actually holding them against your diamond stone can be quite tricky. Now with a hand plane blade, that's not actually all that difficult because there's much more of it. So in this case, what our tool's actually going to do is make your life significantly easier and enable you to put more pressure on the iron and therefore flatten it a lot quicker. Let's do the spoke shave irons first. You're also going to find that there are two different sizes here, different thicknesses, whether you get old or new or different styles of spoke shave. I'm going to make myself two to combat the main two that I have in my workshop. But with this, it's so easy, make as many as you want. So just grab some of your hardwood scraps. Ensure that each piece is 15mm larger on every side to the iron that you wish to make it for. And then once they're cut to size, lay your iron on the actual wood itself, so that the sides of the iron are parallel to the grain, and then just mark off along the side of the iron. The idea of this is that we're going to actually countersink this into the hardwood itself, but only to the depth of around 3/4 of the iron. Now there's a number of ways to do this. I'm going to attack this with some hand tools, but if you have a small parts crosscut sled for your table saw, you could very easily cut this out doing a series of dado passes. Or if you're very careful, you could use your router table. But I do want to make this attainable for everybody, so I'm going to show you a few different hand tools that you could use for this. But whether you're using a table saw or hand tools, the more secure it is, the safer it is. In the case of hand tools, I do what I always do, and I use double-sided tape and stick it directly to my workbench. Nice crisp sides to the recess here is very important to hold the iron in place. So I'm just creating a knife wall by scoring with my marking knife and then following up with a chisel. From here, method one is just to hog out the waste with a chisel, gradually checking the depth against the iron. But equally, you could use a Shinto rasp, or even just high grit sandpaper attached to the back of a plywood stick. And then once you're done, your iron should sit nicely in the recess. Depending on how well you've cut this, you may find that it's absolutely fine without doing the next step. But for me, I like to put quite a lot of pressure on these when I'm lapping them, so I'm going to go one extra step. I'm actually going to fit some magnets into the inside of the recess to hold the iron nice and tight. You'll also notice what I've done on mine is I've actually glued a second piece of wood to it just to thicken it out. They don't have to be beautiful, but comfortable does help. It's easy enough to fit the magnets. A quick hole with a Forstner bit and a little bit of CA glue should hold them in place. I always make sure that they are either flush with the surface or just a hair below it. And this is not only a handy tip for when you're using this jig, it's a handy tip for whenever you're sharpening or honing any plane iron. A little Sharpie rubbed across the surface that you're working on will show you how much progress you've made, but more importantly, which areas are actually touching the diamond stone. I'm just going to give this a very, very quick test to make sure that the jig actually works and that the iron doesn't slip. And as you can see from the scratch pattern on the iron, that actually did an incredibly quick and incredibly good job. What I will say is the water will mix with the filings and it's going to stain your block and stick to the magnet. It's going to need a clean every time. You can make your life a little bit easier and put a bit of finish on this before you start. But because it's such a quick one to make, I think I'm going to leave it as is. This is quite an important tip and not something that I actually considered when I was making this. When you want to remove the iron, I would not try and prise your nails underneath the bevel to get it away from the magnets. I would simply slide it up away from you, and then when there's enough sticking out across the top of the block, take it off. The problem with trying to take it directly off the block is that the magnet is working against you and it could cause the iron to move erratically and you could get a nick. As you can see, I made an identical one for my newer style of irons because they're a little bit thicker and a little bit wider. So now I've got a little block for every style of spoke shave that I use. If I buy one that doesn't fit, I'll make another block. And now to the hand plane iron. So I've got this Stanley iron that I've just taken out of a vintage number 5. I don't know who's had it before me, but it's in a little bit of a mess. So it's pretty pointless me working on the bevel before I've actually worked on the back. Now don't worry about any of the pitting up at the top here. The bit we're working on, that's down here. With this iron, that's going to be around about 1 inch. And in all honesty, you could take this onto your diamond stone and you could work that inch very easily. And that's perfectly fine, and that's what most people will do. But I find because you can only fit 2 or so fingers on this top side here, it makes it a little bit trickier to get downward pressure on it. So why not make a jig for that? And honestly, this is just as easy as the last. Once again, we're just working with some scrap sapele here. You need a piece for the sole of the jig that is going to be just over the size of the iron itself. This will need a couple of holes in it to take the star knobs with the washers that will hold the iron in place. Worth noting at this point, this is a prototype and you're seeing me work through it for the very first time. So you'll see some of the adjustments that I've made at the end and I'll talk you through it as we go. Like here, I've already moved one of the star knobs just slightly further back because the washer itself was getting in the way of the part of the iron that we need to lap. I'm popping a second piece just on the top to act as a handle, but also to thicken the wood up for the next mistake I'm going to make. I've also added a block of wood over where the part of the iron that we want to lap is, so that I can get some good downward pressure, but also maintain some really good control. I've gone pretty basic here. Make it whatever shape you feel you can get a good enough grip on. Now, where I was going to lock the star knobs off through the piece on the other side with a bolt, I've actually decided that it would be far simpler to use some threaded inserts here. They need to have the right diameter hole, and then you need to slightly chamfer the edges of the hole itself so that they countersink nicely. With a bit better planning, I probably could have avoided having to file off one of the washers so they fit together. And yes, that is a broken threaded insert that you'll see right there. I'll come to that in a minute. But once you've tightened off the 2 star knobs together, they lock the iron nicely to the jig. And that's it, it's incredibly simple. I popped a couple of screws through the handle itself just to hold it all together, and I've given it a little test. Before I show you how it works, you'll see that I made one very small error with one of the threaded inserts. When putting these into hardwood, make sure you've got the diameter of the hole right and, importantly, the depth. Because the threaded inserts are very, very weak, and if you try and tighten them and they're not going anywhere, you're just going to strip the inside. But I've just removed enough of it so it doesn't mar the iron. So when I fit the iron, I like to move it so that it's as close to the front as possible without overlapping, and then you can just fix it into place using your star knobs and washers. And then once both star knobs are in place, the iron is locked to the jig. And then you need a diamond plate. You'll notice that if you just lie this flat on the workbench, the star knobs are going to actually catch on the workbench. That's where having them raised up on a tray really helps. So let me show you how well it works. There are a couple of tips with this. Because we've added quite a lot of weight to the back here, you have to ensure that you've got most of your weight down on this bit, otherwise you're going to be putting an angle on the actual iron itself, which is just going to ruin your work. So I've just marked this up with a Sharpie just to show you where my progress goes. So after 30 seconds, you can see where most of my work is being done. Not a huge amount on the front yet. Much better on this bit. So now I'm going to have one more go just to show you the last bit of progress across this front here. There is still a line of the pitting across there, but I have worked past it. So I know I'm now flattening the entire surface. It's just going to take work. And the beauty of this is you can adjust the grip as you saw me doing there to a way that will suit you best. If you haven't used this for a little while, it's worth checking that the base is still flat. If it isn't, just tape some sandpaper to a flat surface and give it a quick sand until it is flat again. I'll be really quick. If you've watched this far and you're getting value out of it, please hit the subscribe, click a like. Now on to the next tip. For this next speedy tip, we're going to head over to the table saw. So we're here at the table saw and we're going to talk about the freebies that you get with it. Whether you've got a job site saw or a contractor saw, I would all but guarantee that the freebies you got with it are really not the ones you're going to be using in a few months' time. And the reason for that is that they're just not very good. Let's take the plastic push stick that they normally come with. It's very brittle, and in all honesty, it's not as good as something you can make yourself from scraps. And I'm not going to tell you what to make, but what I will say is whatever you do make is probably going to be better than what you get free. But that's not all you'll usually get with it, because you'll probably get a mitre gauge too. Now, there is nothing worse than being let down by your tools, especially when you're learning in woodworking. And this will let you down for one specific reason. In this case, the free mitre gauge that you get has got way too much play from left to right to be able to guarantee getting square cuts every time. So I've got one of two solutions. And hand on heart, I'll be honest with you, I have been gifted one of these. But before we get to the gifted one, so that you know I'm not just trying to sell to you, this one, for half the price, will do a pretty good job, and I've been using it for the past year with no complaints. The reason that this is far better than the stock one is because you've got these little grub screws all along that tighten it up into the slot, so you can actually get it accurate to 90 degrees to your blade and keep it there. This will set you back around £50. You can use it on your router table or on a bandsaw, so it does have a multi-function. And I know, this piece of ply scrap, it's not really the best fence, but in a pinch, this has served me well. But when Hongdui over in China reached out and said, do you want to test our mitre gauge with extendable fence? I said, absolutely. But I'm not going to do a review for my viewers. I'm just going to use it for a bit and then say whether I like it or not. This combination will set you back the best part of £190. So it's not cheap, but you get a better mitre gauge than you do for the Axminster one. And then this fence. This fence will do more than I can ever use it for. It's accurate, it's extendable, it's got the stop block on it, and hand on heart for somebody learning to do things like mitre joints, for instance, where you've got to cut perfect 45s, someone who doesn't have a mitre saw, this has been absolutely brilliant. As I said, I'm not going to do a review. I'll leave a link down in the description if you want to check it out for yourself, because the main tip within all of this is look further than the free accessories that you get with your table saw. And don't worry, I know I've only skimmed over this quickly because it is just a quick tip video. If you want to see it in more detail in the future, watch out for every build video, because what accuracy I lose having a job site saw, I'm going to gain as much as I can by having the accessories that go with it, and this is one of them. Check it out for yourself. Now on to the next tip. This tip is a really simple one. Before you glue a box up, you want to check that it's square. Now there's a couple of different ways of doing this. First of all, depending on the size of the box itself, you can grab yourself a square and then just test it in each of the corners to see if the box itself is square. The other way, and the way that I use most often, is to measure the distance from each of the diagonals, and if they match, then the box is square. But that's not the tip. You see, the tip is how you measure them, because this ruler, for instance, starts at the very end. There's no small margin before all of the ticks for the ruler markings start, and that's the way I like it. But if you try and measure from one corner to the other, it's a little bit clunky getting the corner in. The same can be said for a tape measure. The hooks on a tape measure are brilliant for hooking on things to measure the length, or for butting up against something to measure the depth. but they tend to get in the way when you're trying to measure the corner of a box. You can't actually get the end of the tape measure in. And I'm a little bit embarrassed at how long it's taken me to know this. When taking measurements, you don't need to start from 0. Pick an arbitrary number. I'll use 5. Pop the mark in for 5 against one corner, and then take the number from the far corner and just minus 5 from it. This way, you can lay your ruler completely flat. You don't have to worry about getting the end of the ruler into the corner exactly. All you need to do is have that arbitrary number in your head and take it off at the end. It's good with a ruler, but it's great with a tape measure because you keep this hook well away from getting in the way. So this time let's take 10 and I pop that into the corner. And then all I need to do is make sure that I'm reading from 10 and I'm finishing at where it says 30. Compare that with the second and adjust accordingly. On to the next tip. This tip is fantastic and simple and cheap. You've seen blue tape used for a number of things. I almost guarantee you haven't used it for this. I'm going to show you a specific job, but just know this can be used for 100 different things with many different tools. Recently, I've been making jigs, and one of the things I've needed to do on quite a few is to put in some T-track. Now, T-track's great, but it can't sit on top of a piece of wood. It has to sit flush with it. And for that, I tend to use a router. I've got bits that say they're the right size for making the channel that this sits in, but what I've been finding is they're not quite. If this is my jig and I want to run some T-track in it, the first thing you're going to need is a guide, something to run your router along. I'm just attaching a flat piece of wood onto the side to run along because I'm not too worried about where the track actually sits so long as it's somewhere near the centre. And then you start making passes with your router, gradually getting deeper and deeper and deeper until you've got your channel. Now, one thing that I have been finding after I've routed this out is that actually the groove is a little bit too tight for the T-track. And we're talking 0.5 millimetre to 1 millimetre, which is tricky. Because if it was 3 or 4 millimetres, you could shim out this guide piece that you've got on the side and it will move your router across by that distance. But what do you do when it's just a tiny hair that it needs to move across? Because the side of the base of your router rides along this piece here, I'm saying put some blue tape around the side and that will move the router base away by maybe 0.5 millimetre, depending on how many pieces you have. I'm just going to stick 3 or 4 pieces of blue tape on top of each other, and then I'm going to stick it to the base of the router. And now, so long as the blue tape is riding along the side piece here, that's going to move the router away by, well, as many fractions of a millimetre as you use pieces of tape. Do not have the tape going under the base, because that will actually raise the router up and you won't have a flat bottom to your groove anymore. So just have it round the edge and it'll do the trick. And then when you're done, your T-track's going to fit perfectly. I think we can all agree we don't need another video with the 100 uses of blue tape. However, it's the only thing in my workshop that can give me multiple layers of a tiny incremental increase in depth or width or thickness. So having a roll of it handy for any build will benefit you greatly. Now this tip, trick if you like, is for anybody who doesn't have a miter saw, but does have a circular saw and wants to make repeatable angled cuts. Now I just want to be very clear here, I don't mean angles on the y-axis, I mean angles on the x-axis. You see, most people know how to cut square with a speed square, where you hold it against your piece of wood and then run your circular saw along it. And this gets you a 90 degrees or thereabouts every time. But what happens if you want a repeatable angle that's not 90 degrees? And this one came about when I was batching out these mallets. Now the edges of the mallet have got roughly a 5-degree angle on them. And I wanted to cut 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces to make each mallet. Each one had at least 1, if not 2, of the identical angled cuts. It basically totaled up to 6 5-degree cuts per mallet, and I was making 6 or 7 mallets. So it's worth having a little jig for this. And all you need is this. If you've got a mallet that you want to use as a template or an angle as a template, pop it on the piece of wood and then just score a line on the piece of wood. This now gives you the angle that you want to replicate. What you ideally want to do is to get a tilt on that speed square so that now the line matches. But here's the problem, the bottom doesn't. This is where this little block of wood comes in. Holding your speed square tight, just pop the little block of wood in until it is locked between the speed square angle and the wood itself. And then once you've found that point, take it all away and then tape that block of wood onto your speed square. It doesn't have to be tight, it's just to stop it flapping around while you've got your speed square between cuts. So now Every time you want to make that cut, you can now put your speed square against the wood, line your circular saw up with a cut line, and it will always cut that angle. The only thing to note is if you have opposing angles like this, you will just have to flip the wood over for the second cut like I did with the mallets. You can actually do this backwards. If I have the speed square set on this piece of wood and I want to cut a 10-degree angle, I just pivot this back section up to where the little tick mark for 10 is. I very carefully hold it together. I take my block, I slide it into a point where it's between the speed square and the piece of wood, take it away, and then tape it down again. Or if you find it easier, you can actually put the speed square behind the wood you're working on and then pivot it so that you can see the angle of degrees behind the wood and then lock it off there. So now you've got a speedy speed square, because whenever I put that on the piece of wood with the block between the wood and the speed square, I can move it along and make my cut every time, and I'll be keeping that same angle. And I guess the real overriding tip that stems from this tip is it's not always the case that you need to buy another tool to get a job done. If you take another look at what tools you actually have, you might be surprised how many jobs they can each do. So that's it for my tips and tricks. If there's any that you have that you think I should be showing to everyone else, please pop them down in the comments. You'll be helping everybody else that watches these videos and, well, you'll be helping me to make some content, which is always appreciated. As I said before, if you've enjoyed the video, please hit the subscribe, click the like, and if you like these type of videos, try this one. If you've already seen it, YouTube's picked this one for you. Whichever one you click, I'll see you over there. Thanks for watching.